Hi guys, this video is going to be about membrane transport. So moving stuff across the membrane. In the last video, you learned about what makes up a membrane, phospholipids, proteins, glycolipids, glycoproteins, and this one we're going to talk about how stuff actually moves across that membrane. There's two types of transport, two main classes of transport. There's passive and there's active. So just as their names suggest, passive is easy. It doesn't require any energy. Miss Lay is waving at the light and it's making me laugh. Thank you. So in passive transport, things move from a high concentration to a low concentration. So this way, okay? They go from high to low. They want to be equally distributed, and so it's easy for them to go from a high concentration to a low concentration. In active transport, you have to put energy in because you're going from low to high. So you're moving things from a low concentration to a high concentration. So think about like trying to really stuff something into a suitcase. Okay, so like you're packing for a trip and your suitcase is already pretty full and you're trying to put those last two shirts that were on your bed into your suitcase. You have to put a lot of energy in. Whereas when you open that suitcase, when you get where you're going, stuff just flies out. Okay, passive versus active transport. So those are the two classes of transport, and then there's different ways that things move around, that they move across the membrane. So first up is things that actually move across the phospholipid bilayer. So as you saw in the POGIL the other day, the phospho group, the phosphate head of the phospholipid, is polar. It has a charge, but the tail, the lipid part, does not have a charge. So we have a polar and a non-polar area of our phospholipids. So what that means is things that come through the plasma membrane, the phospholipid bilayer itself, have to be non-polar for them to easily get through the membrane and to the other side. So things that are non-polar that don't typically dissolve in water are going to be okay getting through this big area here between the two phospholipid heads. So again, polar means it has a charge. Water has a charge, so things with a charge like water, that's why our phosphate head groups like water, and they're on the outside of the cell, they're near where the water is. So small molecules that are nonpolar can go across the phospholipid bilayer. That means things like oxygen gas, nitrogen gas, and carbon dioxide gas. So they're all small, and they don't have a charge. This all happens via passive transport. So we rely on a high concentration of oxygen in our blood outside of our cells so that that oxygen diffuses into our cells where there's a lower concentration of oxygen, and it just goes right through the lipid bilayer. There is also another way that stuff gets through the membrane is through proteins. So proteins have both passive and active transport systems. I'm going to talk about passive first and then active. Passive transport proteins, there's two ways that it can happen. Trying to get rid of those lines. Okay, there can be a channel, so basically just like a hole in the membrane for that particular molecule to go through. So it's a good spot for that molecule to go through the membrane. So an example is aquaporin. So as you might be able to guess, aquaporin is how water gets into our cells. So it's just a channel that is hydrophilic inside so that water likes to go through there. It's not having any problem. It can just flow through. And it's passive. It goes from a high concentration to low concentration. There's also more of a kind of like a mechanism where there could be a specific shape of a molecule where one type of molecule there's a specific shape of the protein where one type of molecule fits really well in that shape, and that shape can kind of grab that molecule on one side and then open on the other. So it's also kind of allowing a space for that molecule to get through, but it's not just a channel, it's more of an active process. Again, it's passive because it's high concentration to low concentration. Both of these are called facilitated diffusion. So the diffusion of molecules from high to low is facilitated by there being a protein present. Active transport using protein membrane molecules, proteins in the membrane. There's a couple of different ways that this could work. So there can be a situation where, well, I guess in both situations, you need ATP. That's the take-home message. This is active transport. You're going from a low concentration to a high concentration. So in this one, you can see there's only 2 diamonds here, lots of diamonds here, but the diamonds are going this way, and you need to put ATP in. So when you have a problem where you see a picture of a membrane transport protein and you see that there's ATP involved, that's a really big clue for you that this is active transport, because you need to put energy in to get stuff from a low concentration to a high concentration. You might see it like this. ATP turns into ADP plus PI. You guys know that that's the hydrolysis of ATP, and that's what releases energy. Or you might just see kind of an ATP with an energy cloud around it, like we used to see in 9th grade bio, before we knew why ATP was energy. So the other example I have here is a proton pump. So it's specifically pumping protons out of the cell, but again, ATP is required. If you want to do active transport across the membrane, you need a protein. It can't happen through a phospholipid. It needs to be a protein. So 2 other forms of membrane transport that I just want to touch on. We talked about this in the last video, exocytosis. So when your cell makes something that it exports to the outside of the cell, that's exocytosis. Think exo like exit. There's also endocytosis. So in some bacteria cells, they get food from their environment and they engulf it. It's called phagocytosis. So their membrane kind of extends around and collects that food and brings it in. So in this case, it's endocytosis. This is entering the cell. From there, that vesicle would meet up with a lysosome, and that lysosome has enzymes in it. And when they're combined, the enzymes can kind of break up the food into its individual parts so that the bacteria cell can actually use it. So again, these are 2 other types of membrane transport systems, but they're unlike the ones we already talked about. They're kind of a little bit larger scale. So exocytosis and endocytosis. So in summary, we talked about how phospholipids allow for passive transport of small nonpolar molecules. Proteins have both passive and active transport systems. The active transport systems require ATP. Because they need energy to move things from a low concentration to a high concentration. But those passive transport systems needed no energy input because they're going from high to low. We also touched on endocytosis and exocytosis. Remember, endo is enter, exo is exit.